My life was a museum of my own making, a quiet exhibition of carefully curated routines. Each day was a familiar room, filled with the same artifacts: the precise 7 a.m. alarm, the specific grind of coffee beans, the particular weight of the ceramic mug in my hands. I worked from home as a graphic designer, a profession that suited my temperament perfectly. It was a world of grids, hex codes, and pixel-perfect alignment, a digital reflection of the order I craved in my physical space. My apartment was my grandest gallery, a testament to control. The walls were a soft, unobtrusive gray. The furniture was minimalist, chosen for its clean lines and lack of sentimentality. There were no ghosts here, no chaotic memories clinging to the upholstery. There was only the gentle hum of my computer, the whisper of my stylus on the tablet, and the predictable rhythm of my own breathing. It was safe. It was sterile. And in the quietest hours of the night, when the city outside finally held its breath, it was profoundly lonely. He was the one piece of art that didn't belong to my collection. Liam, the building superintendent. He existed outside my carefully constructed frames, a living, breathing sculpture of everything I was not. Where I was angles and quiet tones, he was solid mass and warm, earthy colors. He was tall, with shoulders that seemed built to carry more than just a toolbox. His hair was a dark, unruly brown that he was always pushing out of his eyes with the back of a gloved hand. He moved with a kind of unhurried competence, a physical certainty that I, who could spend 10 minutes debating the placement of a comma, found both mystifying and deeply compelling. He was a collection of sensory data I hoarded like a secret treasure. The low, rumbling timbre of his voice when he said "morning" in the hallway, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. The faint, clean scent of industrial soap and sawdust that clung to his work clothes, a smell of capability and honest labor. The solid, reassuring thud of his work boots on the stairs, a sound that meant things were being fixed, that order was being maintained by a force more tangible than my own anxious will. I observed him from the safe distance of my fourth-floor window, my own personal viewing gallery. I watched him haul heavy bags of salt in the winter, his breath pluming in the frigid air. I watched him patiently explain to Mrs. Gable in 2B how her new thermostat worked, his head cocked with a gentle attentiveness. I watched him laugh with the delivery drivers, a genuine, easy sound that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He was a part of the building's ecosystem, as essential and constant as the plumbing and the wiring. And he was, in my mind, utterly and completely unattainable. The barrier between us was more than just professional courtesy. It was a vast, uncrossable chasm I had constructed from assumption and fear. There was the redhead, for one. A woman with a bright, confident smile who would sometimes pull up in a small blue car around lunchtime, handing him a paper bag through the window. They would talk for a few minutes, her hand resting easily on his arm. Girlfriend, wife, partner. The label didn't matter. She was the lock on the gallery door. She was the velvet rope in front of the exhibit. But even without her, he was Liam. He was a man who fixed things with his hands, who spoke of engines and wiring diagrams. I was a man who lived in a world of gradients and kerning. We were written in different languages. He was prose, sturdy and straightforward. I was a footnote, small and overly detailed. The narrative of my life had no room for a character like him, and so I resigned myself to quiet, distant admiration. It was a familiar ache, this yearning for something beautiful behind glass. It was the defining feeling of my carefully ordered life. I would catalog his brief appearances, the way a stray lock of hair fell over his forehead, the faded logo on his gray sweatshirt, the focused set of his jaw when he was working on a stubborn lock. I would take these small observations back to my quiet apartment, and I would file them away in the silent archives of my heart, where they could be admired without the terrifying risk of ever being touched. It was a lonely way to live, but it was a system, and I understood systems. It was predictable, and above all else, it was safe from the chaotic, unpredictable force of hope. Then the notice appeared. A crisp white rectangle slipped under my door. It was an emissary from the outside world, a disruption to the hermetic seal of my life. The city was mandating the installation of new, interconnected smoke alarm systems in every unit. A schedule was attached. My turn was Friday. Friday afternoon. Liam would have to come inside. Not just into the hallway, not just to the threshold to drop off a package. He would have to come into my space, into my gallery. The week leading up to it was a slow-motion study in anxiety. I cleaned my apartment with a surgical precision, scrubbing surfaces that were already spotless. I curated the books on my coffee table, trying to project an image of effortless intelligence. I worried about the music I should play. Should I play any music at all? The entire exercise was absurd. He was coming to install a smoke alarm, not to critique my life's choices. But his impending presence felt like an audit of my very existence. He, with his scent of sawdust and capability, was going to walk into my sterile, gray world, and I was terrified of what he would see. Or rather, what he wouldn't see. The lack of life, the suffocating order, the quiet hum of a man hiding from the world. Friday arrived, gray and bruised. The sky had been threatening rain all day, a low, oppressive humidity hanging in the air that seemed to mirror the pressure building in my chest. I heard his knock at precisely 2 o'clock. It was a solid, practical sound. 2 firm raps. I took a deep, unsteadying breath, my heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs, and opened the door. "Hey," he said. His voice was that familiar, low rumble, but it sounded different inside my apartment, deeper, absorbing the silence. He was holding a drill and a white plastic disc. "Smoke alarm guy." A small, self-deprecating smile touched his lips. It was the first time I had seen it up close. It did unsettling things to the rhythm of my pulse. "Hi." I managed, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. "Come in." He stepped inside, and the entire equilibrium of the room shifted. My carefully balanced space was suddenly, irrevocably altered by his presence. He seemed to take up more air, more physical and psychic space than I had anticipated. The scent of him, clean soap, a hint of something metallic from his tools, and the faint, fresh smell of ozone from the impending storm, filled my apartment, overriding my own neutral, scentless environment. He moved with that easy competence, his eyes scanning the ceiling. "Should only take a few minutes," he said, gesturing with the drill. "One here, and one in the bedroom." I just nodded, my throat suddenly dry. I felt like a docent in my own museum, unable to speak, simply watching as this masterpiece of a man moved through the exhibit. He worked quickly and efficiently, the whir of the drill the only sound. I stood awkwardly in the kitchen doorway, trying to look casual, as if having a man like Liam in my home was a perfectly normal occurrence. Every small sound was amplified. The scrape of the ladder on my hardwood floors, the soft grunt of effort as he reached up, the quiet click as the new alarm was seated in its bracket. He was just finishing the one in the main room when the world outside went white. A deafening crack of thunder shook the building, so violent it felt like a physical blow. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died. We were plunged into a sudden, disorienting darkness, the only illumination a weak, gray light from the storm-choked windows. And then, a deeper silence. The hum of the refrigerator was gone. The low buzz of my computer in the other room vanished. The building's emergency lights in the hallway outside my door flickered on for a moment, a sickly orange, and then they too went out with a soft pop. We were utterly and completely stranded in the gloom. "Well," Liam's voice came out of the darkness, startlingly close. "That's not ideal." The rain began then, a low hiss that quickly swelled into a roar, a relentless drumming against the glass. The storm had finally broken, and it had trapped us inside. Together, my carefully constructed world had just been shattered by a simple power outage, and the chaos I had spent my life avoiding was now sitting on a stepladder in my living room. My heart, which had been fluttering with anxiety, now began to pound with a terrifying, exhilarating new rhythm. The exhibition was closed. The lights were out, and the art was no longer behind glass. For a long moment, we just stood there in the thick, humming darkness, two strangers marooned in my living room. The only sounds were the roar of the rain and the frantic thumping of my own heart, which I was sure he could hear across the small space. My mind, usually a torrent of overthinking, went completely blank. The system had failed. The routine was broken. There were no instructions for this. "You okay?" Liam's voice was a low anchor in the disorienting gloom. He had climbed down from the ladder, his form a tall, broad silhouette against the gray window. "Yeah," I breathed out, the word feeling flimsy and inadequate. "Just sudden." "Yeah." He moved, and the floorboards creaked softly. He was closer now. I could feel the subtle shift in the air, the faint warmth of his body. Power's out for the whole block, looks like. The streetlights are gone. My apartment, my sanctuary of control, felt impossibly small, charged with his presence. Every sensory input was heightened. I could smell the dampness on his clothes from the humid air, a scent of rain and earth mixing with the familiar sawdust and soap. I could hear the soft whisper of his jeans as he shifted his weight. My entire world had shrunk to the 10 feet of space between us, a chasm of silence and unspoken things. "I have candles," I said, the words rushing out. It was an offering, a desperate attempt to impose some small measure of order on the chaos. Good idea. I navigated the familiar layout of my apartment by touch, my hands brushing against cool walls and smooth furniture. I found the candles in the kitchen drawer where they always were, a small victory for routine. My hands were trembling slightly as I found the matches. The first match scraped and died. The second one flared to life, a tiny, defiant sun in the darkness. I lit the first candle, its small flame pushing back the shadows, casting a warm, flickering glow. Liam's face was illuminated in the soft light. The shadows carved new hollows under his cheekbones and deepened the intensity of his eyes. He was watching me, his expression unreadable. I had only ever seen him in the flat, unforgiving fluorescent light of the hallways or the bright light of day. In the candlelight, he looked softer, younger, less like a building superintendent and more like a man caught in a storm. I lit a few more, placing them around the room. The space transformed. It was no longer my sterile, gray apartment. The flickering light made the shadows dance, turning the familiar room into something intimate and strange, a secret cave hidden from the raging storm outside. "Here," I said, holding a candle out to him. "For the coffee table." He reached for it, and his fingers brushed against mine. It wasn't a fleeting, accidental touch. For a split second, his skin lingered against my own. It was warm, slightly calloused, and a jolt of pure electricity shot up my arm, short-circuiting every rational thought in my head. I pulled my hand back too quickly. "Thanks," he said, his voice quiet. I couldn't tell if he'd felt it too. He placed the candle on the table, and we stood in an awkward silence, two planets in a strange new orbit. We ended up on the sofa, on opposite ends, a respectable chasm of gray upholstery between us. The distance felt both enormous and insufficient. I was hyper-aware of him, of the way he rested one arm along the back of the sofa, the muscles in his forearm defined in the wavering light, of the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing, a sound that was somehow both calming and deeply unsettling. So, I started, needing to fill the silence. "This happens often." He shook his head, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. "First time in a couple of years. The grid around here is usually pretty solid. Must be a bad 1 inch." We fell silent again. The rain was a constant, percussive roar. I felt a desperate need to know more about him, to understand the man sitting in my living room, not just the sculpture I had admired from afar. "Is it what you always wanted to do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Your job, I mean." He was quiet for a long moment. I thought maybe I had crossed a line. Then he sighed, a soft, weary sound. "No," he said, still looking out the window. "Not really. I wanted to be an architect." The admission surprised me. It was a crack in the facade of simple competence, a glimpse of a different life. "What happened?" I asked gently. He finally turned his head to look at me. In the candlelight, his eyes seemed dark and deep. "Life, you know. My dad got sick when I was in my second year of college. This job opened up in the building he managed. It was steady, came with an apartment. I told myself it was temporary. Just until things got better." He gave a small, wry smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That was 10 years ago." "I'm sorry," I said. "It's okay," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "It's a good job. I like fixing things. Making them work." He paused, his gaze dropping to his hands, which were resting on his knees. They were large, capable hands. Sometimes I just feel stuck, like I'm maintaining someone else's building, but I never got around to building my own. There it was, a flicker of vulnerability. It was a revelation that shifted my perception of him entirely. He wasn't just a solid, immovable object. He was a person with regrets and thwarted dreams, just like anyone else. Just like me. The distance between us on the sofa suddenly felt smaller. "The woman who brings you lunch," I said, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them. I immediately regretted it. It was too personal, too prying. He looked up, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "The redhead? That's my sister, Chloe. She worries I don't eat enough." He offered a small, genuine smile this time. "She's been trying to set me up with her friends for months. It's exhausting." His sister. The words echoed in the space between us. Not his girlfriend. Not his wife. His sister. The velvet rope I had imagined for years disintegrated into dust. The gallery door creaked open. It was a dangerous, terrifying thought. "Oh," I said, my voice small. He studied my face for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I had a bad breakup about a year ago," he said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more confidential. "Haven't really been interested in anyone since then." The air in the room grew thick, heavy with unspoken possibilities. The storm raged outside, but inside my apartment, a different kind of storm was gathering. He was looking at me, really looking at me, and I felt stripped bare under his gaze. My years of quiet observation turned back on me. The carefully curated exhibit of my life was exposed, and I found that I didn't want to hide anymore. I wanted to be seen. By him. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the guttering of the candles. The rain softened from a roar to a steady, rhythmic drumming. The darkness outside the windows became absolute. It was late. The power was not coming back. "The main doors are on an electronic lock system," Liam said, breaking a long, comfortable silence. "Without power, the manual override is tricky. And my own apartment key is a fob. I'm as stuck as you are." He said it with a casualness that didn't match the sudden, frantic leap of my heart. He was stuck here, with me, for the night. The thought was both terrifying and electrifying. All the walls of my ordered life, already cracked by the storm, seemed ready to crumble into dust. A reckless, unfamiliar boldness rose up in me. It was the candlelight, maybe, or the intimacy of his confession. Or maybe it was just years of pent-up yearning finally breaking through the surface. "I have a spare room," I said. My voice was steady, betraying none of the chaos churning inside me. "It's just a guest room, really. But the bed is comfortable." Liam looked at me, his expression unreadable in the flickering shadows. The silence stretched, thick with tension. I held my breath, waiting for the polite refusal, the insistence that he'd be fine on the sofa. I had offered a piece of myself, a level of intimacy I hadn't extended to anyone in years, and the possibility of rejection was a physical ache in my chest. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Yes," I said, more firmly this time. "I'm sure." He nodded slowly. "Okay, thank you." I showed him to the room, a space that was even more sterile and unused than the rest of the apartment. I gave him a new towel and a spare t-shirt and sweatpants I kept for, well, I wasn't sure what for. They had never been worn. As he took them, his fingers brushed mine again. This time, neither of us pulled away immediately. The contact lingered, a silent question passing between us in the warm, still air. "Good night," he said, his voice soft. "Good night," I whispered back. I retreated to my own room, but sleep was impossible. My mind was a live wire, buzzing with the events of the evening. He was here. He was sleeping just one thin wall away from me. I could hear the faint creak of the floorboards as he moved around, the soft sound of the door clicking shut. Every sound was magnified. Every shadow in my room seemed to hold his shape. My entire apartment, my fortress of solitude, felt alive with his presence. After an hour of staring at the ceiling, I gave up. I slipped out of bed and padded silently into the living room. He was there. He hadn't gone to bed. He was standing by the large window, a dark silhouette against the deep, rain-washed black of the night sky. He was looking out at the city, a ghost city with no lights, only the faintest outline of buildings against the clouds. He must have heard me, because he turned his head. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. "No," I admitted, moving to stand a few feet away from him, my arms crossed over my chest. We stood in silence for a moment, two solitary figures watching a sleeping city. "It's strange," he said, his voice contemplative. "So quiet. You forget how much noise there is until it's gone." "I like the quiet," I confessed. "Me too," he said. "But not this kind. This is the lonely quiet." His words hung in the air, a perfect articulation of the feeling I had lived with for years. A lonely quiet. He understood. In that moment, the final wall inside me, the one I had been reinforcing for my entire adult life, began to dissolve. "I know what you mean," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. He turned to face me fully. The room was lit by a single, low-burning candle on the coffee table, casting long, dancing shadows. His face was half in darkness, half in a warm, golden glow. He took a small step closer, and the space between us became charged, electric. "All evening," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "I've had this feeling that I shouldn't be here, that I'm trespassing." "You're not," I said quickly. "I'm glad you're here." The truth of the words surprised me. I wasn't anxious or afraid. For the first time, I felt something else. Hope. A terrifying, beautiful, chaotic hope. He took another step. He was so close now I could feel the heat radiating from his body. He was looking at me with an intensity that made my knees feel weak. He lifted his hand, slowly, hesitantly, as if giving me time to pull away. He didn't touch me right away. He just held it there, suspended in the air between us. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was pinned by his gaze, by the overwhelming sense of inevitability. His hand came to rest against my jaw, his thumb stroking softly over my cheek. His skin was warm and slightly rough. The touch was exquisitely gentle, a stark contrast to the strength I knew was in that hand. It was a question, a silent, profound question. I leaned into his touch, my eyes fluttering shut. It was my answer. He made a soft sound in the back of his throat, a sound of relief or recognition, and then he was leaning in. The world narrowed to the scent of him, rain and candle wax and clean soap, and the feeling of his breath warm against my lips. Then he kissed me. It wasn't a hard or demanding kiss. It was slow, tentative, searching. His lips were soft, questioning. It was a kiss that felt like it was learning its way in the dark. I brought my hands up to rest on his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart beneath my palms. It was a rhythm that grounded me, that told me this was real. My mind, my overactive, anxious mind, went completely silent. All the grids and rules, all the carefully catalogued fears and assumptions, they all burned away in the simple, overwhelming warmth of his mouth on mine. This wasn't order. This wasn't a system. This was chaos. A beautiful, terrifying, life-altering chaos. And in that moment, I realized I had been starving for it. I kissed him back, pouring all my years of silent, lonely admiration into that one, simple act. The museum was in ruins, and I had never felt so free. At some point in the deep, silent hours of the night, the power returned. It didn't come back gently. It surged to life with a jolt. The digital clock on the microwave flashed a bright, accusatory 12 o'clock. The refrigerator hummed back to life with a startling shudder. The spell, so carefully woven in the darkness and candlelight, was shattered by the brute force of electricity. We pulled apart instantly, two people caught in a sudden, harsh spotlight. The intimacy of the moment evaporated, replaced by a thick, buzzing awkwardness. In the dim glow of the microwave clock, I could see the startled, wide-eyed look on his face. It mirrored my own panic. What had we just done? I should go to bed, he stammered, his voice rough. He didn't look at me. He took a step back, then another, retreating from the fragile island we had created in the middle of my living room. "Yeah," I said, my own voice a strangled whisper. "Me too." He turned and disappeared into the spare room, the click of the door shutting behind him a sound of finality. I stood frozen in the middle of the room for a long time, the familiar hum of my apartment now sounding alien and hostile. I eventually made my way back to my own bed, but the sheets felt cold. The lonely quiet had returned, but now it was heavier, filled with the ghost of a kiss and the deafening sound of my own anxious thoughts. Morning arrived with a cruel, indifferent brightness. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating every speck of dust, every shadow of doubt in my mind. The storm was gone, leaving behind a world that was washed clean and painfully clear. The magic of the night felt like a dream, a fantasy spun from shadows and desperation. I heard him moving around before I was even out of bed. By the time I emerged from my room, clutching a coffee mug like a shield, he was already dressed in his work clothes from the day before. He was standing by the door, his toolbox in his hand. He looked like the superintendent again, not the man who had confessed his loneliness to me in the dark. "Hey," he said, his eyes fixed somewhere on the wall above my head. He wouldn't meet my gaze. "Thanks for letting me stay." His words were clipped, formal. The easy intimacy of the night before was gone, replaced by a rigid, impenetrable wall. "It was no problem," I said, my voice sounding hollow in my own ears. My anxiety, which had been a low hum, roared to life. It was a mistake. Of course, it was a mistake. A moment of storm-induced madness. He regretted it. He was a good guy, caught in a weird situation, and I had taken advantage of it. I had misread everything. The narrative my brain constructed was swift and brutal. I had ruined the quiet, respectful distance we had maintained. Now I was just the weird, lonely guy in 4A who had kissed him during a blackout. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. "Well," he said, shifting his weight, "I should get going. Lots to check on after the outage." He opened the door and was gone. Just like that. The space where he had stood felt intensely, painfully empty. I spent the rest of the weekend in a fog of self-recrimination. I replayed every moment of that night, every word, every touch, dissecting it, searching for the exact moment I had gotten it so wrong. The kiss, which had felt so real and profound, now seemed like a figment of my imagination, a desperate projection of my own desires. On Monday, the universe decided to twist the knife. I saw him in the hallway as I was getting my mail. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. I saw a flash of something in his panic? Regret? I couldn't be sure. He gave me a tight, brief nod, the kind you give a stranger, and then he looked away, turning his attention to the lock on Mrs. Gable's door with an intensity that was clearly feigned. That single, dismissive nod was all the confirmation my anxious brain needed. It was over before it had even begun. The chasm between us was back, but now it was a gaping, impassable canyon. The museum was still in ruins, but now I was just sitting alone in the rubble. The silence in my apartment was no longer peaceful. It was mocking. For 2 more days, I lived in that state of quiet agony. I avoided the hallways, timing my brief excursions for when I thought he would be elsewhere. I kept my blinds closed. My orderly world was in shambles, and I had no idea how to put it back together. I missed the simple, painful peace of just admiring him from a distance. That felt so much safer than this new, sharper ache of rejection. Then, on Wednesday evening, there was a knock on my door. It was his knock. 2 firm raps. My stomach plummeted to the floor. My blood ran cold. This was it. He had come to deliver the final blow, the "let's just forget this ever happened" speech, the one that would formalize my humiliation. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and opened the door. He was standing there, dressed in a simple dark t-shirt and jeans. He looked tired. He looked nervous. His hands were shoved into his pockets, and he was chewing on his lower lip. "Hey," he said, his voice low and strained. Can we talk?" My heart hammered against my ribs. I wanted to say no. I wanted to close the door and pretend I wasn't home, to retreat back into the safety of my fortress. But I couldn't. I just nodded, stepping back to let him in. He walked into the living room, into the very spot where it had all happened, but he didn't sit down. He paced. He walked to the window and stared out, then turned and walked back, his energy a restless, anxious vibration in the quiet room. I just stood by the door, waiting for the axe to fall. "I've been an idiot," he said finally, stopping his pacing to face me. "The last few days. The way I've been acting. I'm sorry. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. I freaked out, he confessed, his eyes finally meeting mine. They were filled with a raw, desperate honesty. After that night, I woke up the next morning and I was terrified. Not because I regretted it. God, not because of that. I was terrified because I've never felt that way before. He took a breath, the words coming out in a rush now. About anyone. Not like that. And definitely not about a guy. And it scared the hell out of me. So I did what I always do when I'm scared. I ran. I put up walls. I convinced myself that you must have regretted it. That it was a mistake for you. A weird thing that happened in a storm. I thought I was protecting myself, but I was just being a coward. A slow, fragile wave of disbelief washed over me, pushing back the tide of my anxiety. He wasn't rejecting me. He was just as scared as I was. I've been thinking about you for months, he admitted, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I'd find excuses to work on this floor, just hoping I'd run into you in the hall. I noticed the way you always have your pencils arranged on your desk when I'd walk by your window. I noticed you. A lot. The storm. It felt like an excuse. A chance to finally talk to you. And when I kissed you, he shook his head, a look of wonder on his face. It felt right. More right than anything has felt in a very long time. He looked at me, his expression pleading. I know my sister worries about me, he said. But the reason I turned down all her setups isn't because I'm still hung up on my ex. It's because I wasn't interested. Not until I started noticing the quiet guy in 4A. The relief was so sudden, so absolute. It felt like a physical force. It buckled my knees. I leaned back against the door for support, a shaky, breathless laugh escaping my lips. All my intricate, carefully constructed theories of his rejection, all my anxious scenarios, they were all wrong. We had been on opposite sides of the same chasm, both terrified to look across. I thought you regretted it, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I thought I'd ruined everything. I've been hiding in here for days, convinced I was a fool. I finally looked up at him, letting him see all the vulnerability, all the yearning I had kept hidden for so long. Liam, I've been watching you from my window for 2 years. I've memorized the sound of your footsteps. I assumed you were straight, that you were with your sister, that you were so far out of my league that we existed in different universes. That kiss, it wasn't a mistake. It was the one thing I've wanted more than anything, for longer than I can even admit. He closed the distance between us in 2 long strides. He stopped right in front of me, his body caging me against the door. He lifted a hand, just like he had that night, and cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. So you don't regret it? He asked, his voice rough with a relief that mirrored my own. I shook my head, my eyes searching his. Never. Good, he breathed. And then he kissed me again. This time, there was no hesitation. There was no tentative searching in the dark. This was a kiss of certainty, of profound, soul-deep relief. It was deep and sure and tasted of coffee and forgiveness. It was the feeling of coming home to a place you never knew you were searching for. All the broken pieces of my quiet, ordered life clicked into place around him, not in the old, rigid patterns, but in a new, vibrant, and infinitely more beautiful design. He wasn't the chaos that destroyed my world. He was the force that made it whole. We decided to take it slow, a mutual agreement born from his newness to all this and my own deeply ingrained habits of solitude. There were no grand declarations, no immediate blending of our lives. Instead, we began to build something new in the quiet spaces, brick by brick, gesture by gesture. Our first real date was the following Saturday. It consisted of us sitting on my sofa, in the full, honest light of day, with a pizza box balanced on the coffee table between us. We just talked. For hours. I learned about his childhood in a small town upstate, his passion for woodworking, the way his father had taught him to fix things. He learned about my love for typography, my anxiety around crowds, my secret belief that I was born in the wrong century. It was a simple, unadorned intimacy, more real and profound than any candlelit fantasy. For the first time, my apartment didn't feel like a sterile museum. It felt like a home, filled with the warm, rumbling sound of his laughter. A new routine began to form, one that wasn't about control but about connection. Some mornings, I would open my door to find a travel mug of coffee on my welcome mat, still steaming. He had learned exactly how I took it. In return, I started leaving small, silly sketches for him on the door of his workshop in the basement. A cartoon of a heroic-looking wrench, a diagram of a perfectly engineered sandwich. They were our own secret language, quiet gestures of affection that passed between our separate worlds. We learned the topography of each other's lives. I discovered he had a surprisingly sweet tooth and a terrible singing voice that he only unleashed when he thought no one was listening. He discovered that I hummed, a low, tuneless sound, when I was concentrating on a design. We were slowly, carefully, mapping one another, learning the hidden coastlines and secret valleys. One evening, a few weeks later, another storm rolled through. The sky turned a familiar bruised purple, and the wind began to howl. We were in my kitchen, and I was trying to teach him how to make my grandmother's pasta sauce. The lights flickered once, threateningly. I felt a phantom jolt of the old anxiety, the fear of being plunged back into that awkward uncertainty. The lights held. They flickered again, then stabilized. Liam turned away from the stove and looked at me. A slow, conspiratorial grin spread across his face, lighting up his eyes. "Good thing the power's staying on," he said, his voice a low, playful rumble. "Or I might have to kiss you again." I laughed, a real, uninhibited laugh that felt like it came from the deepest part of me. The joy was so pure, so unexpected, it was almost a physical ache in my chest. I went to him, wrapping my arms around his waist and resting my head against his solid chest. I could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart under my ear. For the record, I murmured into his t-shirt, which smelled faintly of garlic and sawdust. I wouldn't have minded. He tightened his arms around me, holding me close. We stood there for a long time, listening to the rain begin to fall, a gentle drumming this time, not a roar. It was no longer a sound of chaos, but a comforting, peaceful rhythm. My life had been a fortress of solitude, built from a blueprint of fear. I had curated my existence so carefully, believing that order was the only way to protect myself from the pain of wanting something I could never have. I treated my own heart like an artifact in a museum, something to be preserved under glass, safe from the messy fingerprints of real life. Liam didn't shatter my world. He didn't break down my walls with a grand, romantic gesture. He just knocked. And when the storm came and blew the door open, he walked inside, not as an invader, but as a quiet, steady presence who saw the lonely man behind the exhibition. He didn't bring chaos. He brought connection. He taught me that vulnerability wasn't a weakness or a structural flaw. It was simply the quiet hum of a shared life, the steady warmth of a hand in mine, the understanding that the safest place in the world wasn't a fortress at all, but the space you build with someone else, right in the heart of the storm.